As he walked past a maid, the king froze when he saw her pendant, the same one his daughter wore when she disappeared 20 years ago. The morning sun cast long shadows across the stone floor of King William's private chambers. He stood at the window, watching as servants scurried about the courtyard below, preparing for the upcoming celebration of his 40 years on the throne of Westbrook. His weathered hands clutched the balcony railing. Knuckles white with tension, the kingdom would celebrate, but his heart remained heavy with an old wound that refused to heal. "Your Majesty," the voice of his chamberlain broke through his thoughts. "The council awaits your approval for the final arrangements." William nodded without turning. "Tell them I'll be there shortly." When the door closed, he moved to a small wooden chest on his bedside table. Inside, nestled on a velvet cushion, lay half of an emerald pendant, shaped like a teardrop with the royal crest engraved upon its surface. He lifted it gently, running his thumb over its broken edge, where the other half had been violently torn away 20 years ago. "Emily," he whispered to the empty room, "where are you, my child?" For 2 decades, he had clung to the hope that his daughter might still be alive, taken during the brutal attack that had claimed his beloved Queen Sarah, the same night that had shattered his world and left this pendant broken, the only physical reminder of the princess who had vanished without a trace. In the servants' quarters, Abigail carefully adjusted the scarf that partially covered her face. The mirror reflected back a woman in her mid-40s, with intelligent eyes that carried a weight beyond their years. The scar that ran from her temple to her jaw remained hidden, a memento from another life. Another name, Miss Abigail, a young maid, appeared at her door. "The head housekeeper says you're needed in the East Wing. They're rearranging the royal portraits for the celebration." "Thank you. I'll be right there." Her voice was soft but carried a firmness that came from years of guarded secrets. As she moved through the palace hallways, Abigail observed everything with careful eyes. The place had changed little in 20 years. The same tapestries, the same smell of beeswax and roses, the same guard standing at attention at every important junction. Only the people had changed, and the king, once vibrant and full of laughter, now moved like a ghost through his own castle. His eyes perpetually searching for something lost, she reached beneath her high collar, fingers brushing against the chain hidden there. The small weight of the pendant against her skin was both a comfort and a burden. Not yet, she reminded herself. The time wasn't right. Queen Victoria watched from her private solar as servants decorated the grand ballroom. At 42, she remained striking, with her auburn hair and penetrating green eyes. She had been married to King William for 15 years now, having captured his attention during a period when his grief had momentarily subsided enough to allow another in. "Your Majesty," her lady-in-waiting announced, "the new kitchen maid has arrived with your tea." Victoria turned with practiced grace as Abigail entered, carrying a silver tray. "You're new," Victoria observed, her gaze lingering on the scarf partially covering Abigail's face. "Yes, Your Majesty, I was hired after Mrs. Holloway's passing." Abigail kept her eyes appropriately lowered. "The scarring," Victoria gestured casually to Abigail's face. "An accident. A fire. Many years ago, Your Majesty." Victoria nodded, losing interest. "Place the tray there and leave us." As Abigail curtsied and retreated, she felt the Queen's eyes following her. A chill ran down her spine. There was something calculating in that gaze that set her nerves on edge. In the palace kitchens, chaos erupted as a young apprentice knocked over a large copper pot of boiling water. Screams filled the air as people scrambled to avoid the scalding liquid. Abigail had just entered when she saw a young kitchen boy slip in the water and fall. Without thinking, she rushed forward, pulling him away from the spreading puddle. As she leaned down, the pendant she wore slipped from beneath her collar, swinging freely in the air for a brief moment before she hastily tucked it away. But it was too late. That necklace. The head cook stared at her, his face paling. "I've seen its like before." Abigail straightened quickly. "It's nothing. A trinket from my mother." Later that evening, as King William dined with his counselors, the head cook approached Robert, the king's trusted guard, and the only survivor of the attack 20 years ago. "There's something you should know, sir," he whispered. "The new kitchen maid. She wears a pendant that looks remarkably like the royal emerald. The one that belonged to the princess." Robert's weathered face hardened. "Are you certain?" "As certain as I can be. It was only for a moment, but the shape, the color, it couldn't be a coincidence." Robert nodded gravely. "I'll inform His Majesty. Speak of this to no one else." King William sat alone in his study, staring at the portrait of Sarah and little Emily that hung above the fireplace. The princess had been only 5 when she disappeared, a bright, laughing child, with her mother's golden curls and his own gray eyes. A knock at the door interrupted his reverie. "Enter," he called, and Robert stepped inside, closing the door firmly behind him. "Your Majesty, there's something you should know." The old guard's voice was low and urgent. "A new servant in the palace. She wears a pendant that matches the description of Princess Emily's emerald." William's heart seemed to stop. For 20 years he had followed countless leads, all ending in disappointment. But the pendant? That was different. Only the royal family knew of its significance, of how it had been torn in two during the attack. "Who is she?" he demanded, rising from his chair. "She goes by Abigail, sire. She joined the staff after old Mrs. Holloway's passing." "Bring her to me." Robert hesitated. "If I may suggest, Your Majesty, it might be wiser to observe her first, if she is involved in something nefarious." The king's eyes flashed with impatience, but he nodded slowly. "Very well. Have her watched, every movement, every conversation. And Robert—" "Yes, Your Majesty. Tell no one of this, not even the Queen." Later that night, Abigail slipped into the servants' quarters, unaware of the eyes that now followed her. She locked her door, and only then allowed herself to remove the scarf and the high-necked dress. In the mirror, the scar on her face told its own story, a jagged line that had healed poorly, a reminder of the night she had failed to save the princess. She removed the chain from around her neck and held the emerald pendant in her palm. Its surface gleamed in the candlelight, the royal crest catching the glow. "I'm close now," she whispered to the empty room. "After all these years, I'm finally close." Outside her window, the palace gardens stretched into darkness. Near the old oak tree, a slim figure in a plain dress knelt in the dirt, her hands working by moonlight. Rose, the young gardener, carefully tended to a rose bush that bloomed unnaturally bright even in the dim light. The same rose bush that Queen Sarah had planted with her own hands before her death. As if sensing she was being watched, Rose looked up toward the castle windows. For a moment, her eyes seemed to meet Abigail's across the distance. 2 women, each carrying pieces of a puzzle 20 years in the making, and between them, a king who still dreamed of finding a princess long gone from this world. Robert moved silently through the palace corridors before dawn, his aging body still possessing the stealth that had once made him the king's most trusted guard. He paused outside Abigail's quarters, listening for movement within. The investigation had begun, and with it, memories he had spent 20 years trying to forget. He closed his eyes, and suddenly he was back there. That terrible night when everything changed. 20 years earlier, thunder cracked overhead as rain lashed against the palace windows. Queen Sarah had retired early with a headache, and 5-year-old Princess Emily had insisted on staying with her mother. Robert stood guard outside their chambers, alert despite the lateness of the hour. The first sign of trouble came with the absence of the usual patrol. Then, shadows moving where no shadows should be. "Intruders!" he shouted, drawing his sword. "Protect the Queen!" What followed was chaos. Men in black pouring through the corridors. The clash of steel, screams echoing through the stone halls. Robert fought his way to the Queen's chambers, cutting down 2 attackers before reaching the door. Inside, he found Queen Sarah standing protectively in front of Emily, blood already staining her nightgown from a wound in her side. "Take her!" the Queen gasped, pushing the terrified child toward him. "Keep her safe." Robert grabbed Emily's hand, but as they turned to flee, more attackers burst through the doorway. In the struggle, the princess's emerald pendant, a gift from the king on her last birthday, was torn from her neck, breaking in 2. Half remained on the floor while the other stayed on the broken chain around Emily's neck. The last Robert saw of the Queen. She was falling, her attackers surrounding her. He managed to fight his way out with the princess, running through the corridors toward the servants' quarters. Jessica, the young wet nurse who had helped raise Emily, met them halfway. "Take her," Robert ordered, pressing the sobbing child into Jessica's arms as more attackers approached. "Get her out of the palace. I'll find you when it's safe." He turned to face the oncoming men, prepared to die protecting their escape. A blade caught him across the chest, and the world went dark when he awoke days later. The queen was dead, the princess was missing, and Jessica was presumed killed in the attack. All that remained was half of the emerald pendant, found in the queen's chambers beside her body. Robert shuddered as the memories receded. 20 years, and the guilt still ate at him. He had survived when others hadn't. He had failed to protect them. "Sir," a young guard approached cautiously. "The king requests your presence." In King William's private study, maps of the kingdom covered the table, with markers indicating where searches for Princess Emily had been conducted over the years. "What have you discovered?" William asked without preamble, his eyes reflecting the candle's flame. "She keeps to herself, your majesty, performs her duties without complaint. The other servants know little about her past, only that she claims to have worked in a manor house near the northern border before coming here." William's fingers traced the outline of Westbrook on the map. "And the pendant? She keeps it hidden. I've positioned Thomas, one of our most discreet guards, as a footman to watch her movements." The king nodded, then walked to the window. Below in the gardens, a young woman with auburn hair knelt among the roses. "Rose has a gift," William said softly. "Those bushes never bloomed properly after Sarah died. Not until that girl started tending them." Robert followed his gaze. "She's an unusual one. Spends all her free time in that garden. Sarah loved those roses." William's voice grew distant. "She said they reminded her of home." A knock interrupted them. Duke Anderson entered, his imposing figure filling the doorway. At 60, the Duke remained one of the most powerful men in the kingdom, his council instrumental in rebuilding after the attack 20 years before. "Your Majesty," he bowed deeply. "The preparations for the celebration are proceeding well. Thank you." "Anderson," William gestured for him to join them. "Your guidance remains invaluable." The Duke's eyes flickered briefly to the maps on the table before he straightened, his expression carefully neutral. "I live to serve Westbrook, sire." "Indeed." William's tone was measured. "You've been a pillar of support since that terrible night." Something unreadable passed across the Duke's face. "A night none of us will forget, your Majesty." In her private chambers, Queen Victoria paced, her silk slippers making no sound on the plush carpet. A serving girl braided her auburn hair, fingers working swiftly. "The new maid," Victoria said suddenly. "Abigail, what do the other servants say of her?" The girl hesitated. "Not much, your Majesty. She's quiet. Keeps to herself. Those scars of hers, have you seen them?" "No, your Majesty. She keeps her face covered." Victoria waved the girl away, her mind working. Something about Abigail troubled her, a familiarity she couldn't place. She moved to her writing desk and penned a quick note, sealing it with wax but no imprint. This was not official correspondence. When Duke Anderson arrived an hour later, she handed him the sealed note. "Have your men look into this woman's background thoroughly." The Duke pocketed the note with a slight bow. "As you wish. Is there cause for concern?" Victoria gazed out the window at the garden below, where Rose worked among the roses. "Perhaps there's something about her eyes, like she's seen this place before." Anderson followed her gaze. "And the girl, you still watch her? She spends too much time in Sarah's garden." Victoria's voice hardened. "The king notices her too often for my comfort. Rose is harmless." But the Duke's tone lacked conviction, his eyes lingering on the young gardener with an intensity that would have seemed inappropriate to an observer. "No one in this palace is harmless," Victoria replied coldly. "You taught me that, dear Duke." In the garden, Rose hummed softly as she pruned the vibrant red roses. At 25, she had worked in the palace gardens for 5 years, quickly becoming known for her almost magical ability with plants, particularly the late queen's roses. She didn't notice she was being observed, not by the queen from her window, nor by Abigail, who had paused on her way to the kitchens. Rose simply worked, her hands moving with practiced precision among the thorns. Beneath the soil of the largest rose bush lay a small box, buried there years ago by Queen Sarah herself. Rose had never found it, but somehow she was drawn to this particular bush, caring for it with special attention, as if something within her knew what lay beneath. Abigail watched the young gardener for a moment longer before continuing her journey. The girl's connection to those roses troubled her. It seemed too coincidental, too aligned with the truth she had carried for 20 years. That night, As Abigail prepared for bed, a knock came at her door. She quickly covered her face before opening it. Thomas, the footman she had noticed watching her, stood outside. "Miss Abigail, Her Majesty requests your presence tomorrow morning. She wishes you to attend her personally during her morning routine." Abigail cursed inwardly, but kept her expression neutral. "Of course. Thank you for informing me." As she closed the door, her hand went instinctively to the pendant hidden beneath her nightdress. The Queen's sudden interest couldn't be coincidence. Someone had noticed something. The pendant, perhaps. Or maybe her occasional glances toward the king. She moved to the small window, looking out at the moonlit garden. In the shadows beneath the old oak tree, a figure stood watching the palace. Robert, the king's guard, the only other survivor of that night. Abigail touched her scarred cheek. Soon she would have to face him, and with him, the truth of what happened 20 years ago. But first, she would need to navigate the dangerous attention of a queen who clearly suspected something. In the distance, thunder rumbled, just as it had on that fateful night. The morning light illuminated Queen Victoria's chambers with a pale golden glow as Abigail entered, carrying a silver tray with the Queen's morning tea. The Queen sat at her vanity, already dressed in a deep burgundy gown, studying her reflection with critical eyes. "Your tea, Your Majesty," Abigail said, setting the tray down and curtsying deeply. Victoria didn't turn. "Remove your scarf." The command hung in the air between them. Abigail's fingers twitched at her side. "Your Majesty, I wish to see your face properly. Remove it." Slowly, reluctantly, Abigail reached up and unwound the scarf. The scar ran from her right temple down to her jaw, puckered and pink. Even after all these years, Victoria turned from the mirror, examining her with calculating eyes. "How did you really get that?" "As I said, Your Majesty, a fire, many years ago." "And where exactly was this fire?" "A manor house in the north, where I previously served." Victoria rose from her seat, circling Abigail like a predator. "Strange. I've made inquiries about you. No one seems to remember a maid named Abigail with such distinctive scarring." Abigail kept her eyes downcast. "I was not significant enough to be remembered, Your Majesty." "Perhaps." Victoria stopped directly in front of her. "Or perhaps you're not who you claim to be." Their eyes met briefly, a silent challenge passing between them. Then Victoria turned away, seemingly losing interest. "You may replace your scarf. The sight disturbs me." As Abigail covered her face again, Victoria added casually, "I understand you've taken an interest in our gardens, particularly the roses. They're beautiful, Your Majesty. Indeed, the late Queen's pride and joy." Victoria's voice sharpened. "You will attend to me each morning from now on. You may go." In the palace archives, Robert hunched over ancient records, searching for anything that might confirm his suspicions about Abigail. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light from high windows as he pored over staff registries from 20 years earlier. His finger stopped at a name, Jessica Morris, Royal Wet Nurse. There was little information. Her age, 25 at the time, her village of origin, her date of employment, and then, the final notation, presumed deceased during the attack on the palace. Robert rubbed his tired eyes. If Abigail was Jessica, she would now be around 45, which matched her apparent age. But why return now, after all these years? And why in disguise? Sir Robert, he looked up to find Thomas, the young guard he'd assigned to watch Abigail. "She met with the Queen this morning," Thomas reported quietly. "Her Majesty demanded to see beneath the scarf." Robert straightened. "And there is indeed a scar, as she claims. But afterward, the Queen seemed troubled. What else?" "She visited the royal gardens during her break, stood watching the gardener girl for some time." Robert nodded slowly. "Keep following her. I want to know everyone she speaks with." After Thomas left, Robert pulled out an old sketch, a portrait of Jessica Morris drawn shortly after she'd been hired as the princess's wet nurse. The resemblance to Abigail was there, beneath the scarring and the years. But he needed proof before approaching the king. Duke Anderson strode through the lower corridors of the palace, his fine boots echoing on the stone floor. He stopped at a small wooden door, knocked twice, then entered without waiting for a response. Inside, a servant was clearing away breakfast dishes. She dropped into a curtsy at the sight of him. "Leave us," he ordered. When the door closed, Victoria emerged from the adjoining chamber, her face tense. "You're late. The king required my presence." Anderson removed his gloves. "What's so urgent?" "The woman, Abigail. I'm certain she's hiding something." Victoria paced the small room. "There's something familiar about her. My sources are looking into her background." The Duke moved closer, lowering his voice. "But we have a more immediate concern. The king has ordered a private investigation. He's seen the pendant." Victoria paled. "Impossible. We were assured it was destroyed." "Apparently not." Anderson's mouth set in a grim line. "If he discovers the truth, after 20 years, he won't." Victoria's voice hardened. "We've worked too hard, come too far. Nevertheless, we need to accelerate our plans." The Duke withdrew a small vial from his pocket. "This should be added to his wine during the celebration feast. It will appear as a heart failure. Tragic, but not unexpected in a man who's suffered such grief." Victoria took the vial, tucking it into her bodice. And then you rule as regent until we arrange a suitable marriage for you, one that consolidates our power permanently." Their eyes met in silent understanding. The culmination of a plan 20 years in the making. "What about the girl?" Victoria asked. "Rose." The Duke's expression changed subtly. "Leave her to me." Rose knelt in the soft earth of the royal gardens, carefully transplanting new rose bushes. Her hands moved with practiced ease, seeming to know intuitively what each plant needed. "They respond to you," a voice observed. Rose looked up to find Abigail standing nearby, watching her work. "Plants are simpler than people," Rose replied, returning to her task. "They don't lie." Abigail moved closer, examining the vibrant red blooms. "These were the Queen's favorites, I'm told." "Yes, the king says I have her touch with them." Rose's voice softened. "I've always felt connected to this garden, especially these roses. How long have you worked here?" 5 years. I started as an assistant gardener. But when the head gardener noticed how the roses thrived under my care, he gave me responsibility for this section." As they spoke, Rose's hand brushed against something hard beneath the soil of the largest bush. She paused, then carefully dug around it, unearthing a small tarnished metal box. "What's this?" she murmured, lifting it from the earth. Abigail leaned forward, her eyes wide. "Open it." With dirt-stained fingers, Rose carefully pried open the rusted lid. Inside lay a folded piece of parchment and a ring bearing the royal seal of Westbrook. "I should take this to the king," Rose said, her voice uncertain. "Wait." Abigail glanced around to ensure they were alone. "Read the note first." Rose unfolded the parchment, revealing elegant handwriting. "My dearest, should anything happen to me, remember that truth lies not in blood, but in the heart. The child is innocent of our sins. Protect her as I cannot. Forever yours." Rose's hands trembled. "Sarah, the Queen." Abigail's face had gone pale beneath her scarf. "Put it back," she whispered urgently. "Bury it again, quickly, it's not safe." "But what does it mean? Who was she writing to?" "I don't know." Abigail's eyes darted toward the palace. "But there are people who would kill to keep this hidden." As Rose reluctantly returned the box to its earthy home, a shadow fell across them. They looked up to find Queen Victoria watching from a distance, her eyes cold and calculating. "Her Majesty has been watching you," Abigail murmured. "Be careful what you say around her." Rose nodded, her thoughts spinning. The note, the ring, the Queen's mysteriously pointed interest. It all seemed connected to something larger, something dangerous. Later that evening, as Rose returned to her small room in the servants' quarters, she found it had been searched. Nothing was obviously missing, but drawers stood slightly ajar. Her few possessions rearranged. On her pillow lay a single red rose, not cut from the garden, but drawn in ink on parchment. Next to it, a warning: some secrets are better left buried. Rose crumpled the paper in her fist, her heart racing. Someone knew she had found the box. Someone was watching, in her own quarters. Abigail sat at her small desk, writing by candlelight. "I found it today. Sarah's message. The girl discovered it while I watched. All these years, and the truth was literally beneath our feet. I must find a way to speak with Robert, after 20 years. It's time he knew I survived. It's time the king learned what really happened that night. She sealed the letter, then held it to the candle flame, watching as it burned to ash. No evidence, no trail. Not until she was ready. Robert stood in the shadows of the palace library, watching as King William pored over old maps and documents. The candles had burned low, casting long shadows across the king's tired face. "You should rest, Your Majesty," Robert said quietly. "The celebration is only 3 days away." William looked up, his eyes red-rimmed from strain. "How can I rest, when we might finally have a lead after all these years?" Robert approached the table, setting down the folder he'd been carrying. "I've found something that may interest you, sire." Inside were sketches of the palace staff from 20 years earlier. Among them, a portrait of Jessica Morris, the princess's wet nurse. "Look at her features," Robert said. "Now imagine them with a scar running from temple to jaw." William's breath caught. "Abigail, I believe so, Your Majesty. Jessica was never found after the attack. Her body was never recovered. But why would she return in disguise? Why not come to me directly? That's what troubles me," Robert admitted. "If she survived, where has she been all these years? And more importantly, what happened to Princess Emily?" William ran his fingers over the sketch, his mind racing with possibilities. "The last time you saw them, I gave the princess to Jessica and told them to flee," Robert said, the memory still painful after 2 decades. "I fought to give them time to escape. And if they did escape," William's voice faltered, "then Jessica might know what happened to your daughter," Robert finished. "But we must proceed carefully, sire. If it is her, she's returned in secret for a reason." The king nodded slowly. "Have Thomas continue watching her? I want to know her every movement, everyone she speaks with, but do not confront her yet." As Robert bowed and left, William remained staring at the sketch, a spark of hope kindling in his chest for the first time in years. In the servants' hallway, Abigail nearly collided with Rose, who appeared distracted and pale. "Are you all right?" Abigail asked, steadying the younger woman. Rose glanced nervously over her shoulder. "Someone was in my room last night. They left a warning." Abigail pulled her into an alcove, away from passing servants. "What kind of warning?" "A drawing of a rose with the message that some secrets should stay buried." Rose's voice trembled slightly. "It must be about the box we found. Has anyone approached you? Asked questions?" "The Queen summoned me this morning," Rose admitted. "She asked how I came to work in the gardens, if I had any family." Abigail's expression darkened behind her scarf. "What did you tell her?" "The truth. That I was raised by a village healer after being found abandoned as an infant. That I've always had a way with plants." Rose hesitated, but she seemed more interested in my appearance than my answers. She kept staring at my face. "Your face?" "Yes." She said I reminded her of someone. Rose touched her cheek self-consciously. "Do I look like someone important?" Abigail studied her. The delicate features, the particular shade of her auburn hair, something in the set of her eyes. A suspicion began forming in her mind. "Important enough that you should be careful," she said finally. "Stay in public areas. Don't go anywhere alone with the Queen or Duke Anderson." Rose's eyes widened. "The Duke. What does he have to do with this?" "Just trust me," Abigail whispered. "And keep that box buried until I tell you otherwise." Duke Anderson stood at the window of his private study, watching as Rose moved through the gardens below. Her resemblance to Sarah was unmistakable from this distance. The same graceful movements, the same way of tilting her head. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Enter," he called. Turning from the window, a man in nondescript clothing slipped inside, bowing slightly. "My lord, we've traced the woman's movements before she came to the palace. And she lived in a village near the northern border under the name Mary Gibson. Before that, the trail grows cold." The man hesitated. "But there's something else. 20 years ago, a woman with a child sought refuge with a healer in that same region. The description matches Jessica Morris, though the child was not the princess." Anderson's hands tightened on the windowsill. "What do you mean, not the princess?" "According to our source, the child was male, approximately 3 years old. The princess would have been 5 at the time of the attack. A boy." Anderson's brow furrowed. "Are you certain?" "The healer was quite specific. The woman stayed for several months, then left without the child. The boy died of fever that winter. Anderson dismissed the informant, his mind working furiously. If Jessica had escaped with a different child, what had happened to Princess Emily? And why would Jessica return now? After all these years, he moved to his desk and penned a quick note to Victoria. We may have been mistaken about the maid. Meet me tonight. King William sat alone in the Royal Portrait Gallery, his eyes fixed on the painting of Sarah and little Emily, his first family, stolen from him by violence and treachery. I always loved that portrait, a voice said softly. William turned to find Abigail standing in the doorway, a stack of freshly laundered linens in her arms. Forgive me, Your Majesty, she said, curtsying deeply. I didn't realize you were here. It's all right. William gestured for her to enter. You're new to the palace staff, aren't you? Yes, Your Majesty, though I've served in great houses before. William studied her, searching for traces of the young woman from Robert's sketch beneath the scarf in the years. The Queen tells me you've taken an interest in the royal gardens. They're beautiful, sire, especially the roses. My late wife planted those roses. William's voice softened with memory. She said they reminded her of home. The young gardener tends them well, Abigail offered. They bloom as if by magic under her care. Yes. Rose has a gift. William's eyes returned to the portrait. Sometimes I see Sarah in those gardens, not as a ghost, but in the way the light falls through the leaves, in the scent of those roses. Abigail followed his gaze to the portrait, her expression hidden by her scarf. Her Majesty was much loved. She was everything to me, William said simply. And Emily, my bright laughing girl for 20 years. I've searched for answers. Perhaps answers come when we're ready to hear them, Abigail said quietly. Their eyes met briefly, and William felt a strange sense of recognition, not of her face, hidden as it was, but of something in her manner. Her voice. Have we met before, Abigail? She hesitated, her hands tightening on the linens. In another life, perhaps, Your Majesty. Before he could question her further, footsteps echoed in the corridor, and Duke Anderson appeared at the doorway. Your Majesty? He bowed deeply. The council awaits your approval on the celebration arrangements. William reluctantly turned away. Of course, I'll join you shortly. When he looked back, Abigail had already slipped away, leaving him with the unsettling feeling that she had been about to tell him something important. That night, as Rose tended the last of the roses before retiring, she sensed someone watching her. Turning, she found Duke Anderson standing at the edge of the garden. You work late, child, he said, his voice unexpectedly gentle. Rose curtsied nervously. The blooms need attention before the celebration, my lord. He moved closer, studying her face with unsettling intensity. You have a remarkable gift with these flowers. Thank you, my lord. Your eyes, he said suddenly. They're very distinctive. Rose shifted uncomfortably. Are they, my lord? Indeed, I've only seen that particular shade once before. His voice had grown softer, almost wistful. How old are you, Rose? 25, my lord. Something flickered across his face. Calculation, recognition, something more complex than either. And you never knew your parents? No, my lord. I was found as an infant. Anderson reached out slowly, almost touching her cheek before withdrawing his hand. Sometimes, Rose, the past has a way of blooming unexpectedly, like your flowers after a long winter. With that cryptic statement, he turned and walked away, leaving Rose with a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. From her window above, Abigail watched the encounter with growing unease. The pieces were starting to come together in her mind. The note in the box, Rose's age and appearance, the Duke's sudden interest. Oh, Sarah, she whispered to herself. What secrets did you take to your grave? Rain lashed against the windows of Queen Victoria's private sitting room as she paced before the fireplace. The storm had arrived suddenly, dark clouds rolling in from the north and shrouding the palace in premature darkness. You're certain of this? She demanded, turning to Duke Anderson, who stood watching her, his face half illuminated by the flickering flames. My sources are reliable, he replied. Jessica Morris escaped with a child, but it wasn't the princess. It was a boy, approximately 3 years old. Victoria's brow furrowed. Whose child? That remains unclear. Anderson moved to pour himself a glass of wine. But it changes things if she didn't escape with Princess Emily. Then the princess truly died that night, Victoria finished. And this charade with the pendant is some kind of revenge. A flash of lightning illuminated the room, followed closely by a crack of thunder. For a moment, Anderson seemed transported elsewhere, his eyes distant. It was a night like this, he murmured, when it all happened. 20 years earlier, Anderson stood in the shadows of Queen Sarah's private chambers, watching as she wrote frantically by candlelight. Rain pounded against the windows, thunder occasionally shaking the glass in its frames. "You can't do this," he said, stepping forward at last. "You can't tell him." Sarah looked up, her beautiful face tense with determination. "I must, Anderson. The lies have gone on too long. William deserves to know the truth, that his precious princess isn't his." Anderson's voice hardened. "That you betrayed him with me. Emily is his daughter," Sarah insisted. "I've had the physician confirm it. I was wrong before, mistaken in my calculations." Anderson's world seemed to tilt. "What? The child is William's, not yours. That's what I'm trying to tell you." Sarah set down her quill. "But there's something else. Something I haven't told either of you." Outside, the storm intensified, as if nature itself sensed the explosive tension in the room. "I'm with child again," Sarah whispered. "This one is yours, Anderson. I'm certain." His heart seemed to stop. "Mine. Yes, I plan to tell William everything. About us. About the baby. I'll accept whatever punishment he deems appropriate. But I won't bring another child into this world founded on lies." Anderson moved closer, his mind racing. "He'll execute me for treason. He'll disown the child, cast it out as a bastard. Perhaps, but it's the right thing to do." He reached for her, but she stepped back. "I've made my decision, Anderson. I'm telling him tonight, after I put Emily to bed." As she turned away, his hand closed around a heavy candlestick on her desk. The rest happened as if in a dream. The swing of his arm, the sickening thud, Sarah crumpling to the floor. He stood frozen, the bloodied candlestick in his hand, as the reality of what he'd done crashed over him. He hadn't meant to kill her, only to stop her, to buy time to think. A small gasp made him turn. Princess Emily stood in the doorway to her adjoining chamber, her eyes wide with horror. "Mama," her small voice quavered. Before he could move, the palace alarm sounded. Guards shouting, running footsteps. Someone had breached the outer walls. The attack he'd arranged as a distraction, timed for when he planned to steal his child. The child he now knew wasn't his, had begun too early. In the chaos that followed, he lost track of the princess. By morning, Queen Sarah was dead. Princess Emily was missing. And Anderson, who had fought valiantly to protect them, was hailed as a hero. Only later did he learn that the queen had been carrying another child. His child. The secret had died with her, or so he had believed. "Anderson." Victoria's sharp voice pulled him back to the present. "Are you listening to me?" He blinked, the memories receding. "My apologies. What were you saying?" "I said we need to deal with this woman immediately. If she's gathering evidence against us." "Us?" Anderson raised an eyebrow. "My dear Victoria, you weren't even at court when Sarah died." "No, but I've spent 15 years helping you maintain this facade." Her eyes glittered dangerously. "Our fortunes are tied together. Or have you forgotten?" Anderson studied her, the woman he'd positioned to capture William's heart during his grief, the perfect puppet queen. Only Victoria had proven to be far more than a puppet. She'd become an equal partner in their deception, and at times he wondered who was truly manipulating whom. "I haven't forgotten," he said smoothly, "but we must be strategic if we move against her too openly." A knock at the door interrupted them. Victoria quickly moved away from Anderson as a servant entered. "Your Majesty, His Majesty, the King requests your presence in the Grand Hall. The final rehearsal for the celebration ceremony is beginning." Victoria nodded. "Tell him I'll join him shortly." When they were alone again, she lowered her voice. "We need to accelerate our plan. The vial." "Not yet," Anderson cautioned. "There's something else at play here. The gardener girl. Rose, what about her?" Anderson hesitated. The possibility that had been growing in his mind seemed too fantastic, too convenient. "Nothing. Just keep watching Abigail. I'll handle the rest." Abigail moved silently through the palace corridors, following the sound of voices to the grand hall where the celebration rehearsal was underway. She slipped into a shadowed alcove, watching as King William directed the proceedings. His voice carrying with authority across the vast space, Queen Victoria entered, drawing all eyes with her regal bearing. The tension between the royal couple was subtle but unmistakable, a coldness in their interaction that spoke of a marriage built on something other than love. As servants rushed about arranging flowers and hanging banners, Abigail noticed Rose enter through a side door, carrying a large arrangement of fresh roses. Duke Anderson, standing near the king, visibly stiffened at the sight of her, his eyes following her every movement. "It's uncanny, isn't it?" a voice said quietly beside her. Abigail jumped, turning to find Robert standing in the shadows. "What's uncanny?" she asked, her heart pounding. "The resemblance." Robert nodded toward Rose. "She has the queen's eyes. Sarah's eyes." Abigail said nothing, but her hand moved instinctively to the pendant hidden beneath her dress. "I know who you are, Jessica," Robert said softly. "I recognized you the moment I saw that scar." She closed her eyes briefly, the weight of 20 years of secrets suddenly crushing. "Then you know why I'm here, to reveal the truth about that night." His voice was barely audible. "Or to protect what's left of it." Their eyes met in the darkness, an understanding passing between them. Two survivors of a tragedy that had altered the kingdom forever. "Both," she whispered. "Emily is gone, Robert. She died that night, despite everything I did to save her." Pain flashed across his weathered face. "I feared as much. But then the pendant. I took it from her body before I fled," Abigail admitted. "I couldn't bear to leave it behind. And the boy my informants say you escaped with." She tensed. "You've been investigating me. Of course you appear after 20 years, wearing half of the royal pendant, and you expect no questions." Abigail glanced toward Rose, who was carefully arranging her flowers near the throne. "The boy died of fever months after we escaped. He wasn't mine. He was the son of one of the kitchen maids who died in the attack. I couldn't leave him behind." Robert followed her gaze to Rose. "And her? What do you know about her?" "Nothing for certain," Abigail said carefully. "But I'm beginning to suspect." She fell silent as Duke Anderson approached Rose, speaking to her with unusual familiarity from their position. Abigail and Robert couldn't hear the words, but they could see Rose's surprised expression, followed by a cautious smile. "He's never shown interest in a servant before," Robert murmured. "Why her? Why now?" "Because he sees it too," Abigail whispered. "The resemblance." As they watched, Queen Victoria's eyes narrowed in their direction. Abigail quickly stepped deeper into the shadows. "She suspects something," she hissed. "I need to show you what Rose found in the garden. A box with a note from Queen Sarah. I think it might explain everything." Robert nodded almost imperceptibly. "Tonight, the old tower, after midnight." He moved away casually, resuming his duties as if their conversation had never occurred. Abigail remained in the shadows for a moment longer, watching as Victoria whispered something to Anderson, both of them glancing toward Rose with expressions that sent a chill down her spine. The pieces were coming together. The note in the garden, Rose's mysterious origins, Anderson's sudden interest, but the complete picture remained just out of reach, like a reflection on troubled water, distorted and unclear. What was certain was that time was running out. In 3 days, the celebration would bring nobles from across the kingdom, whatever was going to happen. Abigail knew it would come to a head before then. The old tower stood like a silent sentinel at the western edge of the palace grounds. Once used as an astronomical observatory, it had fallen into disuse after the attack 20 years ago. Few servants ventured there now, making it the perfect meeting place for secrets. Abigail climbed the winding stone staircase, her lamp casting long shadows against the walls. The pendant felt heavy against her skin, a physical reminder of her failure and her purpose. At the top, she found Robert already waiting, his face grim in the dim light. "Were you followed?" he asked without preamble. "No, the Queen retired early with a headache, and the night guards know me now." Robert nodded, then reached into his pocket and withdrew something wrapped in cloth. "Before we begin, I have something to show you." He unwrapped the package, revealing half of an emerald pendant, the match to the one Abigail wore. "The king has carried this for 20 years, Robert said quietly. never losing hope that his daughter might still be alive. Abigail's hand trembled as she removed her own pendant from around her neck. The two halves fit together perfectly, forming a complete teardrop emerald with the royal crest. "I should have returned it years ago," she whispered, "but it was all I had left of her. Tell me what happened," Robert said, his voice gentle but firm. "All of it. From the beginning." Abigail took a deep breath, 20 years of buried memories rising to the surface. "When you gave Emily to me that night, we fled through the servants' passages," she began. "There was chaos everywhere. Guards fighting, servants screaming. In the kitchen, I found a young boy hiding under a table. His mother, one of the cooks, lay dead nearby. I couldn't leave him." She paced the small circular room, the memories flowing now. "We made it to the postern gate, but there were men waiting. Emily," her voice broke. "She was so brave, Robert. Even at 5, she tried to protect the younger child. One of the men recognized her. He had orders," he said. "The princess couldn't be allowed to escape." Robert's face had gone pale. "Who gave those orders?" "He didn't say, but they weren't there to kidnap her for ransom, as everyone believed. They were there to kill her." The truth hung heavy in the air between them. "I fought," Abigail continued, her hand unconsciously touching her scarred face. "But there were too many. They struck Emily down before I could reach her. The pendant broke in the struggle. When they came for me and the boy, something strange happened." The leader looked at the child and hesitated. "Not this one," he said. "He's not our concern. They left us for dead. But you survived." "Barely. A traveling healer found us near the border and nursed me back to health. The boy died that winter of fever." Abigail's eyes grew distant. "I wanted to return, to tell the king what had happened, but I was afraid. The attack wasn't random, Robert. Someone inside the palace orchestrated it. Duke Anderson," Robert said quietly. "You know, I've suspected for years, but I lacked proof. He emerged from that night a hero with greater influence than ever, and then he maneuvered Victoria into the queen's position." Abigail moved to the tower window, looking out over the moonlit palace grounds. "There's more. 2 days ago, Rose found a box buried under the queen's favorite rose bush. Inside was a note from Sarah to someone she called my dearest, and a ring with the royal seal." Robert frowned. "What did the note say? Should anything happen to me, remember that truth lies not in blood, but in the heart. The child is innocent of our sins. Protect her as I cannot." Abigail turned back to him, and it was signed simply S. "The child is innocent of our sins," Robert repeated slowly. "What child, Emily?" "I thought so at first, but now I'm not so certain." Abigail hesitated. "Have you noticed how Duke Anderson watches Rose? How similar she looks to Queen Sarah?" Understanding dawned on Robert's face. "You think Rose is Queen Sarah's child, but not King William's." The pieces fell into place with terrible clarity. "The Duke and the Queen were lovers," Robert whispered, "and Rose would be the right age, 25, if Sarah was already pregnant when she died. Then someone must have taken the infant after the attack," Robert concluded. "But who and why bring her back to the palace as a gardener?" "I don't know, but I believe the Duke has figured it out, the way he looks at her." Abigail shuddered. "It's the look of a man who's seen a ghost." Across the palace, in her private chambers, Rose sat on the edge of her bed, turning a small object over in her hands. It was a ring, the one from the buried box. She had returned for it in secret, drawn by an inexplicable need to keep it close. The royal seal gleamed in the candlelight. Why would Queen Sarah bury such a valuable item? And why did Rose feel such a profound connection to it? A soft knock at her door startled her. She quickly slipped the ring onto her finger and concealed it with her other hand. "Enter," she called, to her surprise. Duke Anderson stepped into her small chamber. He looked strangely vulnerable, his customary confidence replaced by an almost hesitant demeanor. "My lord," Rose stood and curtsied, and, confused by his presence, "Is something wrong?" "No, nothing's wrong," he said softly. "I apologize for the late hour, but I wish to speak with you privately." Rose tensed, remembering Abigail's warning never to be alone with the Duke. "The hour is inappropriate, my lord." "I know." He remained by the door, as if sensing her unease. "But what I have to tell you cannot wait." nor can it be overheard. Despite her misgivings, Rose was intrigued. "What is it, my lord?" "It concerns your parents." His eyes fixed on her face, studying her reaction. "You were not simply abandoned, Rose. You were hidden, protected." Her heart began to race. "What do you know of my parents?" "Your mother was extraordinary, beautiful, intelligent, passionate." His voice grew thick with emotion. "Everyone loved her." "Who was she?" Rose whispered. Anderson seemed to struggle with himself before answering. "Before I tell you, I must know. What do you remember of your early life?" "Any fragments, any images?" Rose closed her eyes, searching for the elusive memories that sometimes came to her in dreams. "Gardens," she said finally. "Always gardens. The scent of roses. A woman's laugh. A song." She opened her eyes. "That's all." The Duke nodded, as if confirming something to himself. "And the box you found beneath the rose bush. What did it contain?" Rose stiffened. "How do you know about that?" "Because I watched Sarah bury it there, 20 years ago." His eyes held hers. "She knew she was in danger. She wanted to leave something behind for you. Something that would help you understand when the time came." "For me?" Rose felt lightheaded, the implications of his words washing over her. "Are you saying Queen Sarah was your mother?" The Duke's voice cracked. "And I am your father." The world seemed to tilt beneath Rose's feet. She sank back onto the bed, her mind reeling. "That's impossible. The Queen died 20 years ago. I was already an infant when the healer found me. You were saved from the palace that night by someone loyal to your mother. Hidden away where neither the king nor I could find you." Anderson took a step closer. "Look at your hand, Rose. The ring you wear. It belonged to Sarah. She wore it when we met in secret." Rose stared at the ring on her finger, the royal seal now seeming to burn against her skin. "If what you say is true, then I'm the daughter of Queen Sarah and myself, half-sister to Princess Emily." Anderson's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I've spent 20 years believing you died with your mother that night. Finding you here, alive. It's a miracle I never dared hope for." Rose felt as if she were drowning, the foundations of her identity crumbling beneath a tide of revelations. "Why should I believe you? Why tell me this now?" "Because we're running out of time," Anderson said urgently. "Queen Victoria suspects the truth. If she confirms it, your life will be in danger. You must leave the palace before the celebration. Leave." "But this is my home. It's not safe for you here?" Anderson moved to the door. "I've made arrangements. Tomorrow night a carriage will be waiting by the east gate. Promise me you'll be on it." Before Rose could respond, he was gone, leaving her alone with a shattered past and an uncertain future. She looked down at the ring on her finger, the physical proof of his claims. If Duke Anderson was her father, and Queen Sarah her mother, then everything she believed about herself was a lie, and Princess Emily, the girl who had disappeared 20 years ago, had been her half-sister outside her window, beside her. A shadow moved across the garden. Abigail, returning from her meeting with Robert. Rose made a decision. Before she believed the Duke's story, she needed to hear Abigail's version of that fateful night. The truth about the princess might well be the key to understanding her own mysterious origins. Dawn broke over Westbrook Palace with a pale golden light that belied the storm of secrets brewing within its walls. Servants rushed through the corridors, arms laden with decorations, flowers, and linens for the celebration. Now just 2 days away, nobles had begun to arrive from distant provinces, their carriages clattering into the courtyard with increasing frequency. In the midst of this controlled chaos, King William stood in his private study, the reunited pendant lying on his desk. Robert had brought him both halves and the incredible story behind them late the previous night. "You're certain of this?" William asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Emily is truly gone. According to Jessica, Abigail, yes," Robert replied solemnly. "She died the night of the attack." William sank into his chair, the weight of confirmation crushing him after 20 years of desperate hope. "And the men who killed her were sent by Duke Anderson." "Abigail believes so, though she has no direct proof. But there's more, Your Majesty." Robert hesitated. "She believes Rose, the gardener, may be Queen Sarah's daughter by Duke Anderson." The king's head snapped up. "What?" "The timing fits. The resemblance is there, and the Duke's sudden interest in her. Sarah would never have betrayed me, William said with quiet certainty. Never. With respect, Your Majesty, we cannot be sure. The note Rose found suggests complications we don't fully understand. William picked up the pendant, running his thumb over the now complete emerald. I want to speak with Abigail. Bring her to me discreetly after the morning preparations are complete. And the Duke, the king's eyes hardened. Continue watching him. If what you suspect is true, I want evidence beyond doubt before I act. He's too powerful to accuse without proof. And Queen Victoria, her too, if she's involved in this conspiracy. William's voice trailed off, his mind already calculating the political ramifications of accusing his current wife and most trusted advisor of murder and treason. In her chambers, Queen Victoria received her final fitting for the celebration gown, a magnificent creation of deep burgundy silk embroidered with gold thread. It suits you perfectly, Your Majesty, the seamstress murmured. Making minute adjustments to the hem, Victoria studied her reflection with critical eyes. The train should be longer. I want it to extend the full length of the throne room when I enter. As the seamstress scurried to make notes, a discreet knock sounded at the door. Duke Anderson entered, dismissing the servants with a wave of his hand. The preparations proceed well, he asked once they were alone. Everything is in place, Victoria confirmed, turning from the mirror. The vial. Here. Anderson produced a tiny crystal container filled with clear liquid. 3 drops in his wine during the toast. It will appear as heart failure, a tragic end to a celebration. Victoria took the vial, concealing it within a hidden pocket in her gown. And the girl, did you speak with her? I did. Anderson's expression remained carefully neutral. She'll be gone before the celebration begins. You told her the truth, Victoria said, her voice flat. It wasn't a question. I told her what she needed to hear to ensure her cooperation. Victoria's eyes narrowed. She's your daughter, Anderson. Don't pretend your interest is merely strategic. And don't pretend your concern is anything but fear that she might threaten your position, he countered smoothly. Once William is gone, her existence becomes irrelevant. Unless you decide to acknowledge her, a royal bastard could complicate the succession I've so carefully arranged. Anderson smiled thinly. Our agreement stands. After William's tragic demise, you will rule as regent until a suitable marriage can be arranged. Rose will be safely away by then, with no knowledge of her true importance. Victoria seemed unconvinced, but nodded. And Abigail, she knows too much. Leave her to me by tomorrow night. She'll no longer be a concern. In the palace gardens, Rose knelt among her beloved roses, her mind far from her usual peaceful communion with the plants. The Duke's revelations had kept her awake all night, questions chasing each other through her thoughts like autumn leaves in a storm. You seem troubled, a voice observed. Rose looked up to find Abigail standing nearby, a basket of fresh linens on her arm, her pretext for being in the gardens. I need to speak with you, Rose said urgently, privately. Abigail glanced around, noting the increased activity as servants prepared the gardens for the celebration. Not here. Meet me in the old greenhouse after midday meal. No one goes there anymore. Rose nodded and returned to her work, conscious of being watched not only by Abigail, but by others. Queen Victoria from her window, guards positioned too casually along the garden paths, even Duke Anderson, who had appeared on the terrace and now stood observing her with that same unsettling intensity. She felt caught in the center of a web she couldn't see, threads of secrets and lies pulling tighter with each passing hour. The old greenhouse stood at the far edge of the gardens, its glass panes cloudy with years of neglect. Inside, the air was warm and heavy with the scent of damp earth. Abigail was already waiting when Rose slipped through the door. We don't have much time, Abigail said without preamble. You're being watched. We both are. Duke Anderson came to my room last night, Rose began, her words tumbling out. He told me Queen Sarah was my mother, that he's my father. Is it true? Abigail sighed heavily. I believe it is. The resemblance is unmistakable once you know to look for it. But how? The Queen died 20 years ago. I would have been an infant, Abigail finished. Someone must have smuggled you out of the palace before or during the attack, hidden you where neither the king nor the duke could find you. Rose sank onto a rusted garden bench. Then Princess Emily, the girl who disappeared. She was my half-sister. Abigail's face darkened. She was. And she didn't disappear, Rose. She was killed that night. I watched it happen. She pulled down her scarf, revealing the full extent of her scarring. I was Jessica Morris, Princess Emily's wet nurse. I tried to save her, but I failed. These scars are my reminder of that failure. Rose reached out instinctively, touching Abigail's damaged cheek. It wasn't your fault. Perhaps not, but I've carried that guilt for 20 years, along with the knowledge that her death was no accident. It was planned, Rose, orchestrated by someone within the palace. Duke Anderson, Rose whispered, remembering his urgency the night before. He wants me to leave the palace before the celebration. He claims Victoria will have me killed if she confirms who I am. Abigail's eyes widened. When did he tell you this? Last night. He's arranged a carriage for tomorrow evening. Don't go, Abigail said sharply. It could be a trap, if Anderson is behind Emily's death. Your sudden appearance threatens everything he's built. But if he's my father, it doesn't mean he has your best interests at heart. Abigail took Rose's hands in hers. The Duke and Queen Victoria are planning something during the celebration. I don't know what exactly, but it involves the king. Rose's mind raced. Yesterday, I overheard the Queen telling her lady-in-waiting that history would remember her as Westbrook's greatest ruler, that soon she would no longer stand in anyone's shadow. They're going to kill him, Abigail said grimly. With the king dead and no direct heir, Victoria would rule as regent. Unless there was another heir with royal blood, Rose realized. Someone like me, Queen Sarah's daughter. Exactly, which is why you're in danger. Abigail squeezed her hands. Robert has informed the king about Emily's death and our suspicions about your parentage. He wants to meet with me today. I should come with you, Rose insisted. If I'm truly Queen Sarah's daughter, it's too dangerous. Victoria and Anderson are watching both of us. If they suspect we're uncovering the truth, Abigail shook her head. For now, continue as normal. Act as if you're planning to take the Duke's offer to leave, but be ready. Once I've spoken with the king, everything will change. As they prepared to leave separately, Rose remembered something. The ring. From the box, I took it. She held out her hand, showing Abigail the royal seal on her finger. The Duke recognized it. He said Sarah wore it when they met in secret. Abigail studied it, her expression troubled. Keep it hidden for now. It may be the only proof we have of your true identity. They parted ways, each returning to their duties with the weight of secrets and coming confrontation heavy on their shoulders. Above them, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, a fitting backdrop for the tempest about to break over Westbrook Palace. The great hall of Westbrook Palace blazed with 1,000 candles, their light reflecting off polished marble floors and crystal chandeliers. Nobles from across the kingdom filled the space, resplendent in their finest attire, while musicians played softly from a corner balcony. King William's 40th anniversary celebration had officially begun. William himself stood near the throne, receiving guests with practiced grace despite the turmoil in his heart. His conversation with Abigail earlier that day had confirmed his worst fears about Emily's fate and raised disturbing questions about Queen Sarah's relationship with Duke Anderson. Now, watching Victoria glide through the crowd in her burgundy gown, he wondered how much his current wife knew about the conspiracy. Your Majesty appears troubled, Duke Anderson observed, approaching with a goblet of wine. Surely not appropriate on such a celebratory occasion. William studied the man who had been his most trusted advisor for decades, the man who might have murdered his daughter and betrayed him with his first wife. I find myself reflecting on the past, Anderson, on all that's been lost and gained. Anderson countered smoothly. Westbrook has prospered under your rule. That's worth celebrating, is it not? Perhaps. William accepted the goblet but didn't drink. Tell me, do you ever think of Sarah of that night? Something flickered in Anderson's eyes, a momentary lapse in his composure. We all carry those memories, Your Majesty. Some burdens are heavier than others. Before William could press further, Victoria appeared at his side, her hand possessively taking his arm. The dignitaries from Eastmarch have arrived, my dear, she said. They've brought the most exquisite gift. You must come see. As Victoria led him away, William caught Robert's eye across the room. The old guard nodded almost imperceptibly, confirming that their plans were in place. Whatever conspiracy had been brewing for 20 years would end tonight. In the servants' corridor adjacent to the great hall, Abigail adjusted her uniform one final time. Tonight, she wore no scarf, her scarred face exposed for all to see. After 20 years of hiding, of carrying the burden of Emily's death, she would finally bring the truth to light. "You're certain about this?" Robert asked, appearing at her side. "Once you step into that hall, there's no turning back." "I've been living in shadows for too long," Abigail replied. "It's time for the truth, whatever the consequences." Robert handed her a small package. "From His Majesty. He says you'll know when to use it." Inside was the reunited pendant, the emerald teardrop with the royal crest, now whole again. Abigail's eyes filled with tears as she slipped it around her neck, letting it rest visibly against her uniform. "Where's Rose?" she asked. In position, she understands what to do. As servants busied around them carrying trays of food and wine, Robert leaned closer. "The king will call for a special toast at midnight. That's when you'll make your move." In the palace gardens, now illuminated by hundreds of lanterns for guests to stroll through during the celebration, Rose worked quickly. Her hands, usually so steady among her beloved roses, trembled slightly as she extracted the small metal box from beneath the soil where she had reburied it. The king had requested she bring it to him as evidence, the note from Queen Sarah that might help expose the truth. But Rose had made a discovery of her own, something she hadn't shared even with Abigail. Inside the lid of the box, barely visible unless one knew to look for it, was a tiny compartment, and within that compartment, she had found another note, written in the same elegant hand. "The pendant contains the final truth. Both halves must be rejoined for the hidden message to be revealed." What hidden message? Rose hadn't had time to warn Abigail before the celebration began. She could only hope that her role in the king's plan would unfold as intended. Tucking the box into a hidden pocket of her simple dress, Rose made her way toward the servants' entrance of the great hall. As she approached, a shadow detached itself from the darkness of a hedge. "You're not planning to leave after all," Duke Anderson said, stepping into the light of a lantern. Despite my warning, Rose froze, her hand instinctively covering the pocket containing the box. "I need to understand the truth first." "The truth?" Anderson laughed bitterly. "The truth is dangerous, Rose, especially tonight. Is it true that I'm your daughter, that Queen Sarah was my mother?" Anderson's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Yes, though I only realized it when I saw you tending her roses. You have her touch with them, her eyes, her spirit. Then why didn't you claim me years ago? Why the secrecy? Because acknowledging you would have meant admitting my relationship with Sarah. The king would have executed me for treason." His voice hardened. "And now, your existence threatens everything I've built, including your plan to kill the king tonight," Rose said boldly. "With Queen Victoria's help." Anderson's eyes widened briefly before narrowing. "So, you know more than I thought, which means I can no longer allow you to attend this celebration." He reached for her arm, but Rose had anticipated this. Dropping to the ground, she scattered a handful of soil into his face, temporarily blinding him. As he recoiled, she ran toward the palace, her heart pounding. Behind her, she heard Anderson curse, then call out to guards hidden in the shadows. "Stop her! Don't let her reach the Great Hall!" Inside, the celebration had reached its peak. Nobles danced, laughed, and feasted, unaware of the deadly game unfolding in their midst. Queen Victoria moved through the crowd with practiced charm, her burgundy gown sweeping majestically behind her. In her pocket, the vial of poison awaited the midnight toast. King William watched her from his throne, his face betraying none of the anger and grief that consumed him. The knowledge that his beloved Sarah might have betrayed him with Anderson was a wound deeper than any physical pain. Yet even more devastating was the confirmation that Emily, his bright, beautiful child, had been deliberately murdered. "It's nearly midnight, Your Majesty," Robert murmured, appearing at his side. "Are you ready?" William nodded grimly. "And Abigail, in position. But there's a complication." Rose was intercepted in the gardens by Duke Anderson. She managed to escape but is being pursued. William's jaw tightened. "Ensure she reaches safety. We proceed as planned." As Robert moved away, Victoria approached the throne, a goblet of wine in each hand. Almost time for your anniversary toast, my dear. I've brought your favorite vintage. William accepted the goblet, noting the anticipation in her eyes. You've been a remarkable queen, Victoria, so attentive to every detail. Your happiness has always been my primary concern, she replied smoothly. Indeed. William set the goblet aside without drinking. I wonder, did you plan my demise before or after our wedding? Victoria's smile faltered slightly. I don't understand. I think you do. William rose from his throne, his voice projecting across the suddenly quieting hall. Lords and ladies of Westbrook, I thank you for joining me on this momentous occasion. The crowd turned toward him, conversations dying away. In the newfound silence, the main doors to the hall burst open. Rose stumbled in, her simple dress torn at the hem, her face flushed from running. Guards followed close behind but stopped at the threshold, uncertain how to proceed with all eyes upon them. Ah, perfect timing, William said, as if her dramatic entrance had been planned. I wish to introduce someone special to the court. Victoria's hand moved instinctively toward her pocket where the vial rested. William, perhaps this can wait. It has waited 20 years. William cut her off. Far too long. As Rose made her way forward, another figure stepped out from among the servants. Abigail, her scarred face clearly visible, the emerald pendant gleaming at her throat. Gasps rippled through the crowd as recognition dawned on the older nobles. Duke Anderson, who had just entered through a side door, froze at the sight of her. Jessica Morris, William announced. Once wet nurse to my daughter, Princess Emily, presumed dead for 20 years, but returned to us with the truth about that tragic night. The great hall fell completely silent. Hundreds of eyes fixed on the scarred woman who stood straight-backed before them. The royal pendant, a silent testament to her connection to the past. The night of revelations had begun, and with it, the final confrontation that would determine the future of Westbrook. The great hall of Westbrook Palace had witnessed countless celebrations, diplomatic negotiations, and royal proclamations throughout its long history, but never had it held such tension as in this moment, with Jessica Morris, known for the past week as Abigail, standing before the stunned court, the royal pendant gleaming at her throat. For 20 years, King William continued. King, his voice cutting through the silence. I've searched for the truth about what happened the night my wife was murdered and my daughter disappeared. Tonight, that truth will finally be told. Queen Victoria moved to his side, her face a careful mask of concern. My dear, is this really the appropriate time? Our guests will want to witness justice being served, William finished firmly. Jessica, please tell the court what you told me earlier today. Jessica stepped forward, her scarred face illuminated by the chandelier's glow. Many of the older nobles recognized her now, despite the years and the injury. On the night of the attack, she began, her voice steady. I was with Princess Emily when Robert, the king's guard, brought her to me. He had been wounded trying to protect the queen, who was already dead or dying. He told me to take the princess and flee. Duke Anderson moved through the crowd, positioning himself where he could observe both Jessica and Rose, who stood near the king. His hand rested casually near his sword, a detail not lost on Robert, who shifted to stand between him and the king. We tried to escape through the servants' passages, Jessica continued. Along the way, I found a young boy hiding in the kitchens. His mother killed in the attack. I couldn't leave him behind. She paused, her eyes finding Anderson's across the room. At the postern gate, we were intercepted by men who knew exactly who Princess Emily was. They had specific orders. The princess could not be allowed to escape. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Queen Victoria's hands clenched at her sides. They struck her down before my eyes. Jessica's voice finally broke. When I tried to save her, they gave me this. She gestured to the scar on her face. They left me and the boy for dead, saying he wasn't their concern. Only the princess mattered. William's face was etched with grief as he addressed the stunned assembly. For 20 years, I believed my daughter might still be alive. Now I know she was deliberately murdered, on the orders of someone within this palace. This is outrageous. Duke Anderson stepped forward, his voice commanding. Your Majesty, this woman appears after 20 years with an unverifiable story and no evidence. Why would anyone want the princess dead? Because her death was never the primary objective, William replied coldly. It was a consequence of the real target, Queen Sarah. Rose moved to Jessica's side, the small metal box clutched in her hands. Your Majesty, I have something that might help explain. She held out the box. Queen Sarah buried this beneath her favorite rosebush before she died. William took the box, opening it to reveal the note and ring. He read the message aloud. Should anything happen to me, remember that truth lies not in blood but in the heart. The child is innocent of our sins. Protect her as I cannot. His eyes moved to Rose. And this ring bears the royal seal, but with a unique modification known only to Queen Sarah and her closest confidants. He held it up for the court to see. It was her secret correspondence ring. Duke Anderson's face had grown ashen. This proves nothing. These could be forgeries. Perhaps, William conceded. But there is more. He turned to Rose. This young woman has served in the royal gardens for 5 years. Many have commented on her remarkable resemblance to Queen Sarah, a resemblance I myself have noticed but never fully understood until now. Rose stepped forward, her voice trembling slightly. Last night, Duke Anderson came to my chambers. He told me that Queen Sarah was my mother, and that he was my father. The great hall erupted in shocked exclamations. Victoria's eyes flashed with barely concealed fury as she stared at Anderson. He warned me that I was in danger and needed to leave the palace, Rose continued. That Queen Victoria would have me killed if she discovered my true identity. All eyes turned to Victoria, who laughed with practiced disbelief. This is absurd. A servant girl claiming royal parentage based on a supposed midnight confession, Your Majesty. Surely you don't believe these fabrications? I might not, William replied. If not for this, he nodded to Jessica, who removed the pendant from around her neck and handed it to him. William held it up. This emerald pendant was given to Princess Emily on her 5th birthday. It was torn in half during the attack. Jessica kept one half with her all these years, while I kept the other, a symbol of my hope that Emily might still be alive. He pressed the sides of the pendant, revealing a hidden compartment within. From it, he extracted a tiny scroll of parchment, so small it could barely be seen from a distance. Queen Sarah knew she was in danger, William said, his voice heavy with emotion. She left this message, hidden where only I would know to look if both halves of the pendant were reunited. He unrolled the tiny scroll and read, William, if you are reading this, I am gone. Emily is yours. Never doubt it. But I have betrayed you with Anderson. I carry his child. Forgive me. But protect the innocent. Beware the Duke. He knows and is dangerous. The silence that followed was deafening. Then Duke Anderson began to laugh, a hollow, broken sound that echoed through the hall. After all these years, he said, the truth emerges. Yes, I loved Sarah. Yes, she carried my child. His eyes fixed on Rose. I believed that child died with her, until I saw you tending her roses with her touch, her grace. And Princess Emily, William demanded, his voice like ice. Anderson's expression hardened. Sarah was going to tell you everything that night. About us, about the baby. I couldn't allow it. I went to her chambers to convince her otherwise. Things escalated. You killed her, William whispered, the final piece falling into place. It was an accident. Anderson's composure cracked. I never meant. But then Emily saw. She witnessed everything. The attack on the palace was meant to be a distraction, a way to take my child to safety. But the timing went wrong. Everything went wrong. Victoria suddenly lunged forward, snatching a goblet from a nearby table. Enough of this farce. She threw the contents at William's face, but Jessica moved with surprising speed, intercepting the wine with her body. Poison! Jessica gasped as the liquid soaked through her uniform. Some had splashed onto her hands, and already they were turning an unnatural blue. The goblet she gave you earlier. It was poisoned too. Guards moved to seize Victoria, who backed away, her eyes wild. You fool! She hissed at Anderson. You've ruined everything with your sentimentality for that garden girl. Anderson ignored her, his attention fixed on Rose. You truly are Sarah's daughter. I see her in every movement, every expression. Stay away from her, Jessica warned, staggering slightly as the poison began to affect her. Robert caught her arm, supporting her. Victoria, seeing her plans unraveling, suddenly produced a small dagger from within her gown. With a cry of rage, she lunged not at William, but at Rose. "If I fall, so does your precious heir." Jessica broke free from Robert's support and threw herself between Victoria and Rose. The dagger plunged into her chest. She gasped, clutching the wound as she collapsed to the floor. "Jessica!" Rose cried, dropping to her knees beside her. Guards restrained Victoria, who continued to struggle and scream accusations. Duke Anderson stood motionless, the weight of 20 years of deception visible in his defeated posture. "Rose," Jessica whispered, blood staining her lips. "The pendant. There's more." With trembling fingers, she pressed another hidden catch on the emerald. A tiny compartment in the opposite side opened, revealing a strand of golden hair. "Emily's hair," Jessica breathed. Sarah preserved it. Proof that she was truly William's daughter, not Anderson's as he believed. King William knelt beside her, tears streaming down his face. "You protected her to the end. I failed her then," Jessica whispered. "I couldn't fail again." Her eyes found Rose's. "You have her spirit, Sarah's spirit. The kingdom needs that now." As the court watched in stunned silence, Jessica Morris, the woman who had carried the truth for 20 years, took her final breath, her hand still clutching the pendant that had finally revealed the full story of that tragic night. The path to justice had been paved with her sacrifice. Leaving those who remained to face the consequences of 2 decades of secrets and lies, spring had returned to Westbrook, painting the royal gardens in vibrant colors. 3 months had passed since the fateful night of King William's anniversary celebration, a night that had altered the kingdom's course forever. In the royal chapel, hundreds of candles illuminated the solemn space as nobles and common folk alike gathered for a historic occasion. The coronation of Queen Rose Emily, first of her name. Rose stood before the ornate altar, draped in a gown of ivory silk embroidered with golden roses. Around her throat hung the restored emerald pendant, no longer a symbol of tragedy, but of truth revealed and justice served. At 25, she was young to ascend the throne, but the trials of recent months had forged her into someone far wiser than her years. King William watched from a seat of honor, his crown now resting on a velvet cushion beside him. In the weeks following the revelations at the celebration, he had made a momentous decision. Though he would continue to advise the court, he would abdicate in favor of Rose, the daughter of his beloved Sarah, even if not his own blood. "She represents a new beginning," he had told his astonished council, "untainted by the lies and betrayals that have poisoned this court for too long." The high priest lifted the crown, modified to fit its new bearer, and held it above Rose's head. "Do you, Rose Emily, pledge to rule Westbrook with justice, mercy, and truth, to protect the innocent, punish the guilty, and honor the sacred trust placed in you by crown and kingdom?" "I so pledge," Rose replied, her clear voice carrying throughout the chapel as the crown settled upon her head. Her eyes sought out King William's. He nodded slightly, a gesture of blessing and approval that meant more to her than the crown itself. The congregation rose, voices lifting in unison. "Long live Queen Rose Emily." Later that evening, a smaller ceremony took place in the palace gardens. Workers had constructed a marble memorial at the heart of the rose garden, a simple monument bearing the name Jessica Morris and the words "Truth Bearer and Protector, Queen Rose Emily," still wearing her coronation gown but without the heavy crown, placed a bouquet of white roses at the base of the memorial. Around her stood a select few: William, Robert, and several servants who had known Jessica during her brief time at the palace as Abigail. "She saved more than my life that night," Rose said softly. "She saved the kingdom's future with her courage to speak the truth after so many years of silence." William nodded, his face solemn. "And she gave me the peace of finally knowing what happened to Emily. A father should not have to live with such uncertainty." The reunited emerald pendant now rested in a glass case atop the memorial, its 2 halves joined forever, a symbol of how truth, though fragmented and hidden, had finally come to light. "What will happen to them?" Robert asked quietly. All present knew to whom he referred. Queen Victoria awaited trial in a remote fortress, her claims that she had been manipulated by Duke Anderson falling on deaf ears after witnesses testified to overhearing her own plotting. Duke Anderson's fate had been more complex. Though responsible for Queen Sarah's death and complicit in Princess Emily's murder, he had eventually confessed everything. His final request, that the wealth he had accumulated through years of embezzlement be used to establish an orphanage in Princess Emily's name, had been granted. Victoria will remain imprisoned for the remainder of her life, Rose answered. As for the Duke, she hesitated, still struggling with her feelings toward the man who was her biological father. He will face justice tomorrow. What she couldn't say before the others, was how conflicted she felt about his impending execution. She had visited him once in his cell, seeking answers about Sarah, about why he had kept the truth hidden for so long. "I loved her," he had told her, his once proud face lined with regret, not as a king loves a conquest, but truly, deeply. "When I realized what I had done," his voice had broken then, "I've spent 20 years trying to atone for one moment of rage. Finding you, knowing that a part of her lived on, was the only peace I've known." Rose had left that meeting with more questions than answers, uncertain if she could ever forgive the man who had killed her mother, even as she recognized his genuine remorse. As twilight softened the garden's edges, the others departed, leaving Rose alone with the memorial in her thoughts. She knelt beside her mother's favorite rose bush, the one that had concealed the metal box for 2 decades, and gently touched its blooms. "I understand now," she whispered, "why I always felt called to care for these flowers." A soft breeze stirred the petals, carrying the sweet scent around her like an embrace. In that moment, Rose felt a connection to the mother she had never known, a woman who had loved deeply, made tragic mistakes, and tried in her final days to protect those she would leave behind. The sound of approaching footsteps made her look up. William stood at the garden's edge, respectfully waiting to be acknowledged. "Please join me," she called. He walked over and carefully lowered himself to sit on a nearby bench. Age and grief had bent his once straight shoulders, but his eyes remained sharp and kind. "The council is waiting for your first official decree as queen," he said. "Though I told them it could certainly wait until tomorrow." Rose smiled. "I've decided what it will be. The Jessica Morris Memorial Gardens. Not just here, but in every major town throughout Westbrook, places of beauty and peace, open to all people regardless of their birth or station." William nodded approvingly. She would have liked that. "And there's one more thing," Rose added. "I've been studying the royal archives. Did you know that the name Emily means industrious or striving? Sarah chose it," William said softly. "She said our daughter would accomplish great things. That's why I took it as part of my royal name," Rose explained. "Not to replace her, never that, but to honor her memory and Jessica's sacrifice by striving to be the kind of ruler who values truth above comfort, justice above convenience." William's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Both Sarah and Emily would be proud of the woman you've become." Rose looked out over the garden. Now silvered with moonlight, the path ahead would not be easy. The kingdom had been shaken by the revelations of corruption and murder at the highest levels. Trust would need to be rebuilt, old wounds healed, new alliances formed. But for the first time in 20 years, Westbrook's foundation rested on truth rather than deception. The broken pendant had been made whole. The fragmented past had been pieced together. As Queen Rose Emily finally rose to return to her duties, she paused one last time beside the memorial. In the moonlight, the emerald pendant seemed to glow with an inner light, no longer divided, no longer hiding its secrets. "Truth lies not in blood, but in the heart," she quoted from her mother's hidden note, words that had guided her to this moment, and words that would guide her reign in the years to come. Behind her, the roses continued their silent vigil, blooming with renewed vigor, as if they, too, had been waiting all these years for secrets to be unearthed and a new story to begin.